The ship was already a coffin. Everyone knew it, but nobody said it out loud. 412 Elhari lay in the medical bays of the interstellar vessel Caratha's Mercy, and every single one of them was dying slowly and painfully, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The virus had no name yet, because naming something means you understand it, and nobody understood this thing at all. It had started 3 weeks ago with a single crew member in the engine room who complained about a headache and a strange burning behind his eyes. And within 4 days, he was on a ventilator. And within 6 days, he was gone, and by the time the ship's medical team realized what they were dealing with, it had already touched 24 others. Now it was everywhere. The Velhari were a tall species with silver-gray skin and 4 fingers on each hand and eyes the color of deep ocean water, and they had been traveling between stars for over 300 years, and in all that time, they had never encountered something they could not eventually solve with science and patience and the remarkable precision of their medical minds. But this virus was different. Dr. Sorath then stood in the center of the main laboratory and looked at the data on the wall screen and felt something he had not felt in 40 years of practicing medicine. He felt helpless. The pathogen which his team had started calling strain nullies in their reports was unlike anything in the Velhari biological database and unlike anything in the shared galactic medical archives either, and it mutated so fast that by the time they developed a compound to target one version of the virus had already changed its shape and moved on and laughed at them if viruses could laugh. 3 treatments had been tried. All 3 had failed. The patients were not getting better. They were getting worse. And the medical team was running out of ideas and running out of time. The message from the Velhari High Medical Council had come that morning, and it was official, and it was cold, and it was final. The ship was to be evacuated of all non-infected personnel immediately. A containment perimeter was to be established at a distance of 40,000 kilometers. And in 72 hours, if no breakthrough occurred, the Caratha's Mercy would be incinerated by long-range pulse cannons to prevent any possibility of the virus reaching a populated system. 412 people. Gone. Just like that. Dr. Sorath then read the order 3 times and then set it down and walked to the window of the lab and looked out at the stars and tried to find some peace in them and found none. He had made the decision to stay when everyone else left, not because he thought he could still save them, but because he was their doctor and he could not make himself leave sick people alone to die in the dark, and he knew that made him either the most dedicated physician in the fleet or simply a fool, and he was no longer sure there was a difference. The evacuation had taken most of the day. Crew members in environmental suits moving quickly through the corridors, not making eye contact with the patients through the glass, not speaking too loudly. And the whole ship had gone very quiet, afterward the kind of quiet that lands on a place when hope is left and only waiting remains. That was when he saw her. She was in Bay 7, not lying down, not sick, standing at a workstation with her sleeves rolled up and her dark hair pulled back, and her fingers moving fast across the data terminal, and she was cross-referencing something and muttering words under her breath in that clicking rhythmic language of hers. Sergeant Dara Osei. Human. The only human on the ship. She had been assigned to the Caratha's Mercy 8 months ago as part of the Interspecies Cooperation Initiative program. Both sides were still slightly uncomfortable with because humans had only been part of the galactic community for 91 years, and most older species still thought in the way adults think of a child who has wandered into a serious meeting intelligent enough to be there perhaps, but surely not ready for the real conversations. Dara was not a scientist. She was a combat medic and a military liaison officer, and she was 29 years old, and she had a scar above her left eyebrow from something she never talked about, and she had a habit of drinking something called coffee at all hours of the day and night, and she was the most stubborn living creature Dr. Sorath had ever met in his life. He walked to the bay door and pressed the intercom. "You should have evacuated," he said. She did not look up from the screen. "I know," she said. The order was direct. He said the council declared the ship a loss. She was quiet for a moment. I heard her voice was steady like someone who had already made their decision and was not interested in revisiting it. Then she said something that he would think about for the rest of his very long life. She said, "I don't leave people alone to die. That's not something I'm able to do." He stood at the door and looked at her for a long moment. She was not trembling. She was not crying. She was working. There were open files on her screen files he could partially read from where he stood, and they were not Velhari medical files. They were human medical records, old ones, ancient ones with dates going back hundreds of years, and words he did not immediately recognize. Influenza, smallpox, bubonic plague. He did not understand yet why she was reading history. He did not understand yet what those words meant about the species that had survived them. He did not understand yet that the most dangerous thing on this dying ship was not the virus. It was a human woman in Base 7 who was already taking notes. Dr. Sorath then placed his hand on the door panel, and it slid open, and he walked inside, and the air recyclers hummed above them, and somewhere down the corridor a patient coughed weakly, and the stars outside the window burned cold and silent, and the 72-hour clock was already running. Dara finally looked up at him. Her eyes were calm. Her jaw was set. She said, "Pull up everything you have on the virus, every scan, every failed treatment, every mutation log. I want to see all of it." He almost told her it was pointless. He almost told her that the greatest medical minds of 3 spacefaring species had already looked at this data and found nothing. He almost said, "You are a combat medic, not a virologist. What could you possibly see that we did not?" But something stopped him. Maybe it was the file still open on her screen. Maybe it was the steadiness in her eyes. Maybe it was simply that he had run out of other options, and a person who has run out of options will take any door that is still open, even one they don't fully believe in. He sat down beside her, and he began to pull up the files. And neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the ship drifted in the dark, and the clock ran down, and 412 people breathed shallow, painful breaths in the bays around them, and somewhere in those numbers and scans and mutation, logs a human woman from a small blue planet that the galaxy had barely noticed was looking for something that 300 years of Velhari science had missed. She was not afraid, or maybe she was afraid, and it simply did not matter to her. That was the thing about humans that Dr. Sorath then was only just beginning to understand. Fear did not stop them. It never had. She had been staring at the mutation log for 6 hours straight when she said something that made Dr. Sorath then put down his notes and look at her. She said, "This thing is arrogant." He blinked his deep ocean eyes at her what? She pointed at the screen. It mutates fast, but it mutates in a pattern. It has always run away. It never learned to stand and fight, because it never had a whatever species this virus evolved inside. It must have had a weak immune system, something that gave up quickly. So the virus never had to get clever. It just had to get fast. Dr. Sorath then stared at the data she was pointing to. He had looked at the same data 14 times in the past 3 weeks, and he had seen a monster. She had looked at it for 6 hours, and she saw a coward. He said slowly, "That is an interesting way to read that pattern." She said, "It is the only way to read it if you come from a planet that has been trying to kill you since the beginning of time." He did not say anything. She pushed back from the workstation and stretched her neck, and then she did something he found very strange. She started talking about history. Not medical history, just history. She told him about a disease called the Black Plague that had swept through human civilizations over 600 years before they ever left their planet, and had killed 1 out of every 3 people in some regions, and how humans had not understood at the time what was causing it or how it spread, and they had no medicine and no real science, and they died by the millions. She told him about smallpox, which had been killing humans for thousands of years and had wiped out entire populations when it reached parts of the world that had never seen it before, and how it took centuries before a human doctor figured out that exposing someone to a weak version of the disease could protect them from the strong version, and how that one idea changed everything. She told him about a disease called HIV that attacked the very system the body used to defend itself against disease, and how humans had no cure for it for years, and people died and were afraid, and the world argued, and then slowly, painfully over decades, they found ways to fight it, not perfectly, but enough. She told him about a flu that had circled the entire planet in a single year and killed more people than a world war. And she told him all of this in a quiet voice, like she was reading a list, like it was something she had made peace with long ago. Dr. Sorath then sat very still. He said, "How many people?" She said, "Across all of it, billions." The word landed in the room like something heavy. He said, "And your species survived all of that?" She nodded. "We didn't just survive it." She paused. "We built vaccines. We built antibiotics. We built surgical techniques in the field with no proper equipment. We learned how to identify a mutation pattern, Because we had seen enough of them, we learned how to fight blind, because we spent most of our history doing exactly that. He looked at her differently now. Not the way the fleet officers looked at her, which was politely tolerant. Not the way the council representatives looked at humans, which was careful and slightly condescending. He looked at her the way you look at something when you suddenly realize you completely misunderstood what it was. The Velhari had been spacefaring for 300 years, and in that time, they had built clean cities on 7 worlds and developed medicines that could repair cellular damage at the molecular level, and they had never in their recorded history lost more than a few thousand people to any single disease because they caught things early and responded fast, and their science was precise and powerful, which meant they had never truly been broken by a plague, which meant they had never had to think the way she was thinking right now. He said, "You are telling me that your people became doctors because they had no other choice." She almost smiled. "I am telling you that my people became very specific kinds of doctors, the kind that work with what they have, the kind that try something even when they're not sure will work, the kind that fail, and write down exactly how they failed so the next person can fail better." She turned back to the screen. She said, "Your doctors looked at this virus, and they used the best tools they had, and the best knowledge they had, and the virus beat them. That is not a failure of intelligence. That is a failure of experience. Your species never had to fight something that kept moving." She pulled up a new file from her personal terminal, something from a human medical database, and he could see it was old, very old. The formatting was different from modern documents. She said, "This is a paper written by a human doctor named Fleming in Earth Year 1929. He discovered the first antibiotic completely by accident, because a mold contaminated one of his petri dishes. And instead of throwing it away and starting over, he looked at what the mold was doing to bacteria he was studying." She looked at Venn. She said he looked at the accident and asked why. Dr. Sora Venn felt something move inside his chest. A Velhari scientist would have discarded the contaminated dish. She nodded slowly. "I know." The silence between them was long. Outside the bay window, the evacuation fleet sat at its holding distance 40,000 kilometers away, a ring of ships waiting like polite mourners at a funeral that had not technically started yet, but everyone knew was coming. Dr. Sora Venn thought about the patients in the bays. He thought about the 72-hour clock. He said, "What are you looking for specifically?" She said, "The virus is running in a pattern. If I can predict where it runs next, I can build something that is already waiting there, not chasing it, ambushing it." He said that would require knowing its mutation path 3 or 4 steps ahead. She said yes. He said, "We have never been able to model that. The variables are too many." She said, "I know, so I am not going to model it mathematically. I am going to do something your computers cannot do." He waited. She said, "I am going to guess." He stared at her. She met his eyes, and there was no arrogance in her face, no performance, just a flat, simple honesty that was somehow more unsettling than confidence would have been. She said, "Educated guessing based on pattern recognition, based on experience with things that move similarly on Earth, not certainty. Just a very informed guess made by someone who has studied what happens when you let a coward run long enough." She was already pulling up the Velhari pharmaceutical inventory. Her fingers moved fast. She said without looking at him, "I need 3 things from you: your full mutation log, starting from patient 0, a list of every compound you tried, and how the virus responded to each one, and access to your synthesis lab." He should have hesitated. He was a careful man, a precise man, a man who believed in proper procedure, and tested methods, and peer-reviewed conclusions. But there were 412 people breathing shallow, painful breaths in the bays around him, and the clock was running, and the pulse cannons were waiting, and the best minds in civilization had already raised their hands and walked away. He stood up. He said, "Come with me." And she was already standing. And they walked out of Bay 7 together into the quiet corridors of the dying ship, and somewhere behind them the glass-lined bays of Velhari sick turned in their beds and breathed, and did not know that the person who was going to try to save them was a young woman from a small, unremarkable planet that had survived every single thing the universe had thrown at it, not because it was the strongest or the smartest, but because it simply refused in its bones, in its blood, in its stubborn, ridiculous heart to give up. That refusal had a name. Humans called it hope, but from the outside looking in, it looked a lot more like something else. It looked like fury. She built the first compound in 4 hours. It was not elegant, and she knew it was not elegant, and she did not care, because elegance was for people who had time, and time was the one thing they did not have. The synthesis lab was clean and well-stocked, and Dr. Sora Ven stood beside her and handed her what she asked for without questioning anymore, and she respected that about him the way she respected anyone who could set aside their own pride when it mattered. The compound was built on three things. The first was an old Earth antiviral base originally designed to slow the replication speed of RNA viruses, and she had found a chemical equivalent in the Velhari pharmaceutical stores close enough that she was reasonably sure it would behave the same way. The second was a targeting agent taken from one of the Velhari failed treatments, not the treatment itself, but a small component of it that had briefly slowed the virus in 2 patients before it mutated past it, and she stripped that component down and rebuilt it to match where she believed the virus was going next, not where it was. The third was something she could not fully explain to Dr. Sora Ven, because it came from instinct more than textbook, and she saw his discomfort with that, but she held to it, because her instincts came from a species that had been reading disease patterns long before it had the tools to understand them scientifically. She looked at the finished compound in the small synthesis vessel. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "I need a test subject." Dr. Sora Ven said the patients in Bay 3 are the most recently infected. The virus is youngest in their systems. We could begin there. She shook her head. He looked at her. She was not looking at the bays. She was looking at her own arm. He said no. She said yes. He said, "Dara, that is completely out of the question. You could die. You are not even Velhari biology. The virus may interact with your system in ways we cannot predict. You have no idea what it will do to a human." She said, "That is exactly why I should be the one." Her voice was calm the way a river is calm just before it drops into a waterfall. She said the Velhari patients are already fighting the virus. Their systems are already under stress. If I give them an untested compound and it reacts badly, it could kill them faster. But I am clean. My system is a blank page. If I infect myself first and test the compound on myself, I know exactly what the virus looks like at hour 0. And I know exactly how my body responds, and I can measure everything cleanly. She paused. She said also. She looked at him, and something shifted in her face, something that was harder to name than courage. She said, "My immune system is different from yours. I told you about what humans survived. All of that survival is written into our biology. We carry immune memory from thousands of years of disease, exposure. I do not know for certain that my body can fight this virus, but I think it can slow it. And if it can slow it even a little, that gives the compound more time to work. We are not just testing the compound, we are testing whether human biology has anything to fight this thing at all." The lab was very quiet. The air recyclers hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a patient cried out softly and then went still. Dr. Sora Ven stood with his 4-fingered hands at his sides and looked at this human woman and tried to find an argument that would stop her, and found nothing that would work, because everything she said was logical, and everything she said was also terrifying, and those two things sat in his chest at the same time like 2 stones. He said, "You understand that I cannot authorize this." She said, "I know I am not asking you to authorize it." She held up the small vial of collected strain Nully's virus sample that she had already taken from the storage unit while they were talking. His eyes went wide. He said, "When did you?" She said, "About 20 minutes ago, while you were labeling the compound ingredients." He took a step toward her. She stepped back, not in fear, but in the way someone steps back when they have made a decision and do not want it taken from them. She said, "Ven, look at me." He stopped. She said, "I have read your reports. I have read every single attempt your team made. I know how hard you all tried. I know this was not about lack of skill or lack of care, but you've been fighting this virus the way you know how to fight things, carefully, systematically, waiting for certainty before you act, and the virus is faster than certainty." She looked at the vial. She said, "Humans learned a long time ago that sometimes you have to walk into the fire to understand it." She uncapped the vial. He said her name once, just once, low and quiet. She pressed the applicator to the inside of her wrist. She looked at him. She said, "Start the clock." And she administered the virus to herself. The next 72 hours were the worst of Dr. Sora Ven's long life, and he had seen many terrible things in his career. The fever came first at hour, for not severe, but present a steady heat that climbed slowly and made her skin look different, a deepness on the brown of her face that he had not seen before. She kept working through the fever. She kept making notes. At hour 9, she vomited twice in the lab washroom and came back both times wiping her mouth and sitting back down and asking him for data. At hour 14, she had chills so strong her hands were shaking, and she had to hold a stylus with both hands to write, but she kept writing. At hour 16, she said something strange. She said it is trying the same trick it tried on patient 7C, that she pointed at her own scan results on the screen, same mutation jump. She was almost excited. She said, I was right about the pattern. He said, Dar, you have a fever of 39.4. She said, that is high for a Velhari for me. It is unpleasant, but manageable. Write it down. He wrote it down. She administered the compound to herself at hour 18, when the scan showed the virus reaching the cellular density level she had been waiting for. And then they waited. Hour 19. Hour 20. At hour 22, her fever spiked hard, and she gripped the edge of the workstation, and her knuckles were tight, and her breathing was controlled, very deliberately controlled, and Dr. Soroven sat across from her and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and he watched her and thought that he had never in his life seen anything fight the way this creature fought. Not with weapons, not with anger, just with presence, with refusal, with the absolute unwillingness to fall down. Hour 26. Her fever started to drop, slowly, 1/10 of a degree, then 2/10. At hour 29, she fell asleep in the chair. He did not wake her. He ran her blood scan himself while she slept. He looked at the results for a long time. The virus was still present, but it was not growing. For the first time since strain, nullies appeared on this ship. It was not growing. He sat back in his chair and put his four-finger hands over his face and breathed. At hour 31, she woke up, and the first thing she said was, show me the scan. He turned the screen toward her. She looked at it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we need to adjust the compound. The second component needs to be stronger. The virus found a small gap in the targeting. I felt at hour 22, she touched her chest. I felt it try to go sideways, and it almost worked. He said, you felt it. She said, I know what it sounds like, but yes, combat medics learn to read their own bodies the way mechanics learn to hear an engine. You feel things before the scanner shows them. She was already reaching for the synthesis equipment. Her hands were steadier now. She said, round 2, and this time we closed the gap. The second compound was better. She built it in 2 hours and administered it to herself without hesitation. And this time the fever did not spike the way it had before. It climbed to a certain point, and then it stopped there as if it had hit a wall and could not climb past it. She watched her own scan results in real time. The virus was running. She could see in the data the way you can see a frightened animal running a field. By the way the grass moves, a pathogen was jumping mutation pathways faster than before, which meant it was scared, which meant the compound was working, which meant she had been right about the gap and had closed it. At hour 47, since she had infected herself, the viral count in her blood began to drop, not slowly, fast. Dr. Soroven was watching the monitor when it happened, and he stood up from his chair without meaning to, and just stood there with his hands at his sides, staring at the numbers falling, and he did not say anything, because there were no words ready in any language he knew for what he was seeing. She was sitting on the examination table by then, wrapped in a thermal blanket, because the compound had dropped her temperature too low, and she was cold, but her eyes were on the screen, and when she saw the numbers falling, she closed her eyes and just breathed it out slowly, like someone setting down something very heavy that they had been carrying for a long time. She said, run it against Bay 3 patients. He said the compound was built for human biology. The molecular base is different from Velhari's cellular structure. She said, I know, but the targeting component is built for the virus, not for me. The virus does not care what body it is in. It uses the same pathways, the same mutation logic. If the targeting works on me, it should work on them. We adjust the delivery agent for Velhari biology, and the core mechanism stays the same. He looked at her. He said, you are telling me to take a compound you built for yourself and give it to 412 critically ill patients. She met his eyes. She said, I am telling you that in about 22 hours this ship gets incinerated. So yes, that is exactly what I am telling you. He did not argue. He adapted the delivery agent himself. He knew Velhari biology better than she did. And she stepped back and let him work. And that was the thing he noticed, and filed away the way she knew what she was good at and knew what she was not, and handed things off without ego. And that kind of thinking saved more lives in a crisis than any amount of intelligence alone. They began with Bay 3. For patients the most recently infected, the ones whose systems were not yet at full collapse. They administered the compound and waited. The first hour was nothing. The second hour was nothing. In the third hour, the fever of the youngest patient, a junior navigation officer named Seraph, who was 23 years old and had been unconscious for 2 days, began to drop. Dr. Sorath then was the one who noticed it first because he was checking the monitors every few minutes and could not stop himself. And when he saw Sarath's numbers change, he pulled up the other 3 patients in that bay, and 2 of them were showing the same shift. He walked out of the monitoring station and into the corridor, and he called her name. She was down the hallway, sitting against the wall with her knees pulled up and her head back, and her eyes closed, and she looked terrible in the pale flat light of the ship, corridor dark circles, and pale lips, and the particular stillness of someone who'd been running on nothing and has finally stopped. She opened her eyes. He said Bay 3. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. They stood together at the glass and watched the monitors, and the numbers kept moving in the right direction, and Sarath, the young navigator, moved on the bed, not in pain, but just shifting the way a person shifts when sleep begins to change into something lighter and more real. Dara pressed her hand flat against the glass. She did not say anything, but her jaw was tight, and her eyes were very bright. They expanded to the other bays and stages, then synthesizing as fast as the lab could manage, Dara helping when her hand stopped shaking, which was not always but was often enough. By hour 60, the entire ship was medicated. By hour 60, for they were seeing improvement across all bays. Not full recovery, not yet. The patients were still weak and fragile, and the virus was not gone, but it was losing, and that was the most important word in the universe right now, losing. At hour 67, Dr. Sorath then sent a message to the Velhari High Medical Council. It was a short message. He was not a dramatic man. It said treatment compound developed and administered all patients showing positive viral. Response request postponement of incineration. Order full report to follow. He sent it, and then he stood and stared at the outgoing message log for a moment, and then he went back to work. The response came 11 minutes later, and it was not short. The council's lead physician sent back 6 pages of demands for data and verification, and the names of every compound used and the methodology, and the test protocols and the biological basis. And somewhere buried in the middle of the page, for written in the careful formal language of official medical communication, was a sentence that said, "Please confirm, was this treatment developed aboard the Caritas Mercy without external research support?" Dr. Sorath then typed back one word, "Confirmed." Then he added the treatment was developed by Sergeant Dara, OSE Human Interspecies Liaison in cooperation with Dr. Sorath Van Velhari Medical Corps. He sent it. For a few minutes there was nothing from the council. Then the comm system lit up. Not with one voice, but with many. The frequency was suddenly crowded with requests and questions and demands from the council and from the fleet officers and from the evacuation ships, still holding at their 40,000-kilometer distance. And somewhere there was a journalist who had been embedded with the fleet and somehow gotten hold of the medical channel and was asking in a very fast and slightly breathless voice if it was true that a human had developed a treatment for strained nullies. Dr. Sorath then turned the volume down. He walked to Bay 3 and looked through the glass. Sarath, the young navigator, was awake, lying still, eyes open, looking up at the ceiling, alive. The doctor put his hand against the glass very gently. Down the corridor, he could hear Dar in the lab, still working, still adjusting the compound ratios of the patients who were not yet responding, as well as the others still trying to close whatever gaps remained, because that was what she did. She kept working, she did not stop, and celebrate she kept working until the last one was safe. He watched Sarath breathe, in and out, easy and slow. And Dr. Sorath Van, who had been a physician for 40 years and who had seen many things and kept himself professionally calm through all of them, stood alone in the corridor of a ship that was supposed to be a grave and felt something move through him that started in his chest and moved up into his face, and his eyes became very hot, and he was grateful there was no one in the corridor to see it. The incineration order was officially canceled 17 minutes later. The evacuation fleet began moving toward the ship. And somewhere in the medical database of the Galactic Shared Archive, a new file was being created, cataloged under Novel Antiviral Treatment Strain Nullies, Source Human Earth. 3 weeks after the last patient in Bay 7 was cleared of strain nullies and walked out of the medical ward under his own power, the Caritas Mercy was still docked at the Velhari Station Orith Prime, undergoing deep cleaning and structural review, and the story of what happened on the ship had moved through the fleet and through the broader galactic community the way fire moves through dry grass fast, unstoppable, and leaving everything different in the places it touched. Dara did not feel like a story. She felt tired. She sat in the observation bay on Deck 6, which was her favorite place on the ship, because the window there was large and curved, and the stars came in at an angle that made them look close enough to touch, and she had a cup of coffee going cold beside her, because she kept forgetting to drink it, and she was looking at nothing in particular with the emptiness of someone who's been running very hard for a long time and has finally stopped and does not quite know what to do with stillness. Dr. Soraven found her there. He had been looking for her for an hour. She heard him come in and did not turn around because she knew his footsteps by now for light steps, and then a pause that was him. He sat down beside her. They were quiet together for a while, which was something they had gotten comfortable with over the past weeks, the comfortable silence of people who had been through something hard together and did not need to fill every moment with words. Outside the window, a small transport was making its approach to the station, and its running lights blinked slow and steady in the dark. He said, "The council wants to give you a formal commendation." She said, "I know Ambassador Farron told me. He said it would be a significant honor. No human has ever received one." She said, "I know that too." He said, "You do not seem excited." She turned her head slightly and looked at him sideways, and there was something in her face that was hard to read, not unhappiness, exactly more like the expression of someone sitting with something large and complicated that they have not sorted out yet. She said 412 people almost died because the best doctors available looked at the situation and decided it was hopeless. I am glad they did not die. I'm glad I could help. But I do not feel like celebrating a system that came close to incinerating people because it ran out of ideas. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a fair thing to say." She looked back at the window. She said, "I am not angry at you. I want to be clear about that." He said, "I know." She said, "Your team tried everything they knew. You stayed when everyone else left. That matters to me." He said, "But..." She said, "But your system decided too quickly that there was no more trying to be done and gave up before all the options were exhausted, and 412 people almost paid for that with their lives." The transport outside had docked now, and the running lights went off, and the dark was very dark and very full of stars. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. He said, "Were you afraid when you infected yourself, when the fever was at its worst, and you did not know yet if the compound would work? Were you afraid?" She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that means a person is being honest with themselves before they speak. She said, "Yes, every second of it I was terrified." He said, "You did not look terrified." She said, "I know that is a human thing. We learned a long time ago how to keep moving while we are terrified, because the alternative is to stop moving, and we cannot afford to stop. We never could afford to stop." He leaned forward slightly with his elbows on his knees and looked at the stars. He said, "I have been thinking about your people since all of this. I have been reading your history, not the official diplomatic summaries, the real history, the long version." She glanced at him. He said, "You lost billions across your history to disease and war and cold and starvation and every other thing your planet threw at you. And you still built cities. And then you built ships. And then you flew those ships into space and showed up at our door and said, 'Hello, we are here. What did we miss?'" She almost laughed, a small exhale through her nose, almost. He said, "Other species have history of suffering, but there is something different about yours I could not identify for a long time. And then I read something one of your ancient philosophers wrote, and I think I finally understand it." She waited. He said, "Most species, when they are broken by something, they remember the breaking. It shapes them into caution, into fear of that thing ever happening again, into building walls so high that nothing gets through, and that is sensible, that is rational." He looked at her. He said, "But humans remember the surviving, not just that they survived, but how every dirty, improvised, desperate, impossible method they used, every accident they turned into a discovery, every moment someone looked at a hopeless situation and tried one more thing. You remembered all of it. You wrote it down. You passed it to your children. Across thousands of years, your entire species has been collecting tools for surviving things that should not be survivable." Dara looked at him for a long moment. She said softly, "We call it medicine, but you are right that it is more than that." She picked up her cold coffee and held it in both hands. She said, "When I was a kid, my grandmother told me something. She said our people have been the bottom of everything: slavery, plague, famine, war. And we are still here." She said, that means something. She said, you carry that with you. Every time you walk into a room where someone says it cannot be done, you carry every single person who survived the thing that was supposed to end them. They are in your blood. They are in your hands. So use your hands. The observation bay was very quiet. Somewhere on the ship something clicked and settled into silence. Dr. Sorven sat back in his chair. He said, I filed my official report last week. You should know that in the section where I am required to classify the human species' role and potential within the interstellar community, I did not use a standard designation. She raised an eyebrow. He said the standard designation for new species is emerging civilization, limited utility, developmental observation recommended. She said that sounds about right for how most people out here see us. He said I crossed it out. She looked at him. He said I wrote species of critical value in high-pressure medical and crisis environments, recommend immediate integration into interspecies emergency response programs. Note, do not underestimate them, not even once. She stared at him. He met her eyes, and his deep ocean eyes were very steady and very serious. He said, I mean it, every word of it. She looked away, first out at the stars, and her jaw was tight for a moment in the way it got when she was holding something in. Then she said, very quietly, Van. He said yes. She said, thank you for staying. He said, I stayed because I am a doctor. She said, I know that is exactly why I am thanking you. They sat together in the curved window light with the cold coffee between them, and the stars outside burning away. They had always burned through every plague, and every war, and every impossible situation that some stubborn small creature on a small blue planet had somehow found a way to survive. Somewhere in the medical bays behind them, Seraph, the young navigator, was eating a real meal for the first time in weeks, slowly with both hands wrapped around the bowl like it was something precious. The 412 were alive, not because the system saved them, because one human woman looked at a death sentence and decided it was negotiable. Because she came from a species that had never once in its entire long, bloody, brilliant history looked at the worst thing in the room and agreed to lie down. Dr. Soreth Van would spend the rest of his life telling this story to anyone who would listen, not because it was remarkable, because it was the most human thing he had ever seen, and he had finally understood what that meant. It meant they are the ones you want in the room when the room is on fire. It meant they are the ones who walk toward the thing that is supposed to be hopeless. It meant they will infect themselves with your disaster and come out the other side holding the cure. It meant when everything says stop, they do not stop. It meant something the Velhari did not have a word for, something the humans had not named either, but they lived it every single day, on every planet, in every dark corridor of every dying ship, where someone decided that hopeless was just a word, and words could be changed.